In today's lesson, we are going to be starting chapter 14, and 14 is all about what are called random variables. And so in this lesson, you're going to find out what a random variable is, and then the probability distributions that go with those random variables. And in this chapter, we're going to be talking about something called discrete random variables, and that's going to go along with something called the binomial distribution. And then we're also going to be talking about continuous random variables, and that's going to go along with a distribution called a normal distribution. So we will come to those eventually. All right, but first of all, what is a random variable? So that's what we're going to look at on this first page. So we're going to start with a little experiment, tossing two coins. We've done this before. And if you think about it, you have regular coins with a head and a tail, and you toss the two coins. You can get a head or a tail on the first one, and you can get a head or a tail on the second one. And so what we want to do is list what all the possible outcomes of this experiment are. And we know we can list this in words, we can list it in symbols, in all different configurations. So one way that you could list the outcomes is we could do the first coin and then the second coin. And again, we've seen this before, and just do a little tree diagram. So your first coin can be either a head or a tail. Your second coin can be either a head or a tail. Right, and then once you do that, you can always look at then what the outcomes are, and then a second way that you can write them is just the outcomes is as a list. So you can see here we have head, head, so that would represent this, head, head. Here we have head, tail, so that would be head, tail. Then we have tail, head, and then we have tail, tail. So that's another way that you can list the outcome of that experiment, is just by making a list like that. Another way that you can do it, and we did it back in other chapters, is with sort of a two-dimensional grid. So we could say, all right, here's my first coin, and here's my second coin. And my first coin can come out either heads or tails. And my second coin can also come out either heads or tails. This is getting a little bit messy here. Let's bring this down. And then you can just list the outcomes up here in the grid. So this first space right here would represent heads, heads. This space would represent heads, tails. This space would represent tails, heads. And then the last one, tails, tails. So it's just another way that you can represent that outcome. Now, suppose, however, we want to use numbers to represent the outcomes so that we can calculate some probabilities rather than just using letters or symbols. So this is where the definition of a random variable comes in. So note it says that a random variable represents in number form the possible outcomes of a probability experiment. Random variables are usually represented with the capital letters such as X or Y or T your book likes to use, and so forth. All right, so let's take a look at this specific example that we were just doing for the tossing the coins. So let's suppose that we decided that we wanted X, which is what it's called, our random variable, our random variable to stand for the number of heads that are tossed. So if you look at this, you can see, for this toss, there are two heads that are tossed. In this one and this one, there's only one head tossed, and in this one, there are no heads tossed. So we can see that the values that X can take on are 0, 1, and 2. And so, in fact, when we write that as a set, that's called the sample space of X. Those are the possible outcomes of that probability experiment. And then as it says down here, there's one type of a random variable, it's called discrete, and that usually comes from counting. And discrete means they are just separate numbers, all right, and it can't take on a whole bunch of decimal values in between. A continuous random variable, though, is usually a random variable that's found by measuring. So for instance, if we were going to find the heights of men, and we said it was between 50 centimeters and 250 centimeters, you could take on any of those values in there. And so that's called continuous because it can be decimals in the middle. It doesn't have to just be whole numbers. So we're going to stop here and we